Hello, I would like to give you an overview over the first 4 modules that we will be discussing in this class. They're all concerned with the same subject, inequality, but the 4 authors whom we will be discussing represent very different takes on the causes and therefore on the solutions to the problem of inequality. The first one that we're talking about is Mr. Andrew Carnegie, and he was, of course, a main beneficiary of inequality. In the 1880s, when he rose to wealth and power as the owner of the near monopoly on the United States steel production, he also emerged as an advocate against socialism and for an unfettered free market. Well, unfettered except, of course, with a strong government to protect the private property of the wealthy few. Carnegie found a justification for his wealth in the writings of social Darwinists, and more than anybody else, he was a popularizer of these ideas. His argument that you find spelled out in the text we're reading is that inequality is a blessing, it is a virtue, because the alternative is either you have all that marvelous progress that the 19th century has brought, electrical lights, fast railroads and steamships, gas-powered appliances instead of coal stoves. In other words, all the trappings of modern convenience and civilization, not even to mention the advances in medical science that were galloping at the time. So if you want all of that stuff, if you want civilization, if you do not want to sit in a tent on a dirt floor, then you want inequality, because the creators of all this greatness, of all this progress and technology that makes life more civilized and that makes mankind better are the great wealthy few. They are the ones who gave us these marvels. So if you're going to drag them down to the dirt floor where you exist, then there is no progress. We're all going to go back to the Stone Age. And his example of the Native Americans that live in a state of equality is, see here, everybody is equally as poor, and yes, they are all equal. The chief of the tribe lives little better than the people who he commands. Now, Andrew Carnegie certainly emphasized the value of hard work and frugality and other virtues that presumably predict success and that lead to a rise to the top of those individuals who truly stand up. And he is shown on this picture here on the right-hand side. He essentially invented the sport of golf, which is rooted in his native Scotland, and popularized it as something that the wealthy do in their ample leisure time, unaware perhaps of the contradiction that on the one hand he is praising the value of constant hard work and the need never to slack, while at the same time spending the waning decades of his life on the golf course. In fact, while he was away in Scotland golfing, he left the running of his business empire to his CEOs, William Frick, most prominently, and in Carnegie's absence, but with his knowledge, Frick employed militant tactics to keep the workers in line, spying on people who might be suspicious of wanting to unionize, using hired guns to intimidate or kill workers who strike, and so forth. So for Carnegie, that was maybe an ugly flip side of the wealth and the splendor that was created by industry and progress, but unavoidable. If the people didn't know what was good for them, if they were inadvisably asking for a greater share of the wealth, they were asking to take away some of the, if not the main incentive that the wealthy had for creating all that good stuff. And therefore they were inadvertently working to tear down all civilization in demanding a living wage, in demanding shorter hours, in demanding a share of the wealth. Now, on the other side of this conflict between capital and labor, you have Samuel Gompers, and we will be talking about his letter, his open letter to a judge who was presiding over a grand jury investigation into a man by the name of Eugene V. Debs, who goes on to become the presidential candidate for the Socialist Party USA several times in a row. And Eugene Debs at the time was the head of the American Railway Union that had gone on strike after several years in which the railroad companies had acted in concert to lower wages of their employees at the same time that they were doing economically quite well. Gompers argues that the wealth that the wealthy command, and that is certainly amassing, that is making all of society more civilized and better, is in fact the creation of the labor of the millions of people who get very little of the benefits. And he points out that the state, including the judge in this trial, that was going after the labor union under the pretext of interfering with the US mails, because after all, if the mail is transported by railroad, and if you strike against the railroad, you are interfering with the transportation of the mails. And again, the deployment of hired guns and National Guard to put down that strike. The lockout in many cases of striking workers by the great monopoly companies like the Pullman Company that made railroad cars and that was on strike, the US Steel Company owned by Andrew Carnegie that also locked out striking workers, as well as the conditions in these company towns where people who were employed in industry often had to move in order to get their job to a house in a city owned by the company that they worked for, where they had no alternative but to buy their groceries from a store owned by their employer, to send their children to a school owned and staffed by their employer, and to worship in churches likewise owned by their employer, with ministers hired and paid for by their employer. And in many of these company towns, at the end of the month, when people received their paycheck, it turned out that all the cost associated with the privilege of living in the company town exceeded the benefit of the wage. So at the end of the month, you ended up owing money to your employer for having spent money on necessary things like school, groceries, and rent, all of which you paid to your employer, and that the wage did not, in fact, suffice to pay for all these things. So it's a catch-22, and people are getting into more and more debt by virtue of working in these company towns. So when they went on strike, of course, they lost everything. They lost their job, they were kicked out of town, and the people that Gompers describes as literally freezing to death in the city of Chicago in the dead of winter were precisely people who had been kicked out of a company town while they were on strike. So for Gompers, the solution to this enormous gap between the rich and the poor was simply to allow workers to organize, to bargain collectively, to get together and say, we as your workers demand that you give us higher wages that pay for our needs. That would not be to the detriment of civilization. It would not suddenly end with the collapse of all property, propriety, religion, and morality, but rather for the working masses, it would make it easier to live good, decent lives. And in those cases where industries had agreed to pay more as the result of a strike, it did not have the effect that the industry suddenly went out of business. All it meant was that, yes, the profit that the owners took home was less in relation to the amount of money that the workers were paid in wages. Margaret Sanger, as a social reformer, has a different approach to the problem of poverty and inequality. For Sanger, one of the biggest drags on the budget of working class families was to have children. And the reason people had more children than they could afford, who then of course would grow up malnourished, oftentimes forced to go to work in factories in their teens without finishing their education, and therefore poorly educated, hence in their adult life also forced to take jobs that didn't pay very well. The reason why people kept having more children than they could afford to was because there was no way of preventing pregnancy. And if, as a couple, as a married couple, you were going to have sex, you were going to get pregnant because there was no legal way of getting contraception. The reason for this was, of course, politics. One of the great captains of industry and finance, a Mr. Comstock, who was a senator for the state of Nevada in the 1870s, had introduced a bill into Congress, the Comstock Act, that not only made the use of contraception a crime, but also criminally prosecuted the discussion of contraception. So a doctor or a social worker or anybody really who advised a woman that there was such a thing as contraception or how to use it and how to obtain it would be committing a crime under that law. And this law remained on the books for a very long time. Sanger fought to reform this and to allow, under certain limited conditions, that doctors may discuss with married couples contraception and may prescribe it to them. And the reason for that was that she wanted, her ideal, her vision was that in the working class, some of the problems that people faced would be alleviated if they could limit their offspring to 2 children. If they would wait longer in their lives before they had those children, when they were more settled in and more mature. And so that these children could grow up with all the benefits of a loving family that could take care of them, that would give them an education, that would give them enough to eat, that could provide them with health care. And the observation that she made in the working class neighborhoods of American cities, of that great number of impoverished children, was the main motivation behind this approach. And of course, Margaret Sanger, who goes on to found what later becomes known as Planned Parenthood, is vilified in her time as somebody who wants to undermine Christianity, who wants to allow women to lead promiscuous lives, to thereby denigrate the virtue of womanhood and so forth. But to her, this was really a question of what is important to you. Do you care how people live? Does it matter to you whether they eat and have housing, whether their needs are met? Do you make it their problem that it isn't, that they don't have these things, that they do suffer deprivation? Or do you try to help them without assigning blame? But rather, do you approach inequality by saying, how do we make sure that as a rich society, we actually do provide equal opportunities for everybody, and we don't allow people in our midst to persist on a bare minimum? And of course, Margaret Sanger was active in the 1920s, and it's important to keep in mind that the poverty rate in this country, in other words, the number of people, the percentage of people who live on less than half of the average income at any given point in time. That's the statistical definition of poverty. If you take all the incomes in a society and you put them in one big lump, you take the average, you divide that by 2, that's your poverty level. So the percentage of people living in poverty in 1929, before the stock market collapsed, was 40%. This is during the golden 1920s, the roaring 1920s, when the country was awash in modernization and newfangled things like gramophones and radios and so forth. So underneath that is a rot of poverty and misery. And people are approaching that, like I said, from different angles. Now, a fourth one, much more in the vein of Andrew Carnegie, is Henry Ford, who, of course, is in a generation following that of Carnegie, a captain of industry, a major beneficiary in the system. He is one of the richest people in the country. He is the creator of the auto industry. He is again one of these figures like Carnegie with the steel making, with the scaled up, industrialized, large scale steel making, like later on Bill Gates with the personal computer. Ford fits the myth of the entrepreneur who creates a new product essentially out of his brain. That's hogwash, of course. It's his engineers and it is his workers. He is the guy who gives the capital to make that happen. But the automobile is not his brainchild and his creation. He is just the guy who owns the factory. But that doesn't matter in the mythology of wealth as the product of the brains of a handful individuals who are the creative sort and therefore deserve all the wealth that they can amass. Now, Ford, especially once he is no longer the only, as soon as his company is no longer the only one that manufactures automobiles, is no longer making quite as much money as he used to when he was a monopolist, when he was the only one that was selling cars. During World War I, too, he is forced by the government to switch some of his production to military equipment, which he resents. He doesn't want to be told what to do, especially not by the government. As part of the deal of fighting the war and keeping the home front clear of conflict, the government also mandates that companies pay their workers more. And that to Ford also reeks of socialism and equality, which he resents just as much as Gompers did a generation before him. But unlike Gompers, who suspected that his workers were simply too stupid to understand that he, as the inventor and brain, and whose brain was the father of all that wealth and inventiveness, deserved his wealth, Ford suspected something more, some evil machinations behind the scene. And he became convinced that it was a Jewish conspiracy that denied people like him the full share of the wealth that they did deserve. That whenever somebody said the workers should be paid a living wage, or government should have a right to regulate industry to make sure that the owners of industry don't exploit workers to the point where it's simply not sustainable, somebody had to be behind that. And so in every car that anybody test drove in a Ford dealership or took home from there, you would get a free copy of the Dearborn Inquirer, a newspaper owned by Ford, although he maintained that he had nothing to do with the content. It just happened to reflect his views. And the Dearborn Inquirer was a mouthpiece of anti-Semitic propaganda. It ran a serialized version of the fake protocols of the elders of Zion. These protocols were a forgery produced, wait for it, the Russian Secret Service under the Tsar around the turn of the 20th century. And the pretense was that this was the minutes of a meeting between the leaders of the Jewish world conspiracy that showed what their plan was to get the people, the Christian peoples of the world, worked up against each other and send them to war, a war that would then be profitable for the Jews and would lead to the enrichment of the Jews. So this was a theory of how the World War I had come to be as the result of a Jewish conspiracy. And it also attempts to explain inequality, capitalism, as well as communism as machinations of the Jews. And therefore, Ford's conclusion from these protocols of the Elders of Zion, which he takes at face value, is that if you, as my worker, think you're not getting a fair share, and if you think that I am greedy and I am taking more than is my due, consider that in fact we both have the same enemy, and that is the world Jew. It's the world conspiracy of Jews. So if your union leaders and the socialists tell you to fight against me, they are doing the bidding of the Jews. They're dividing us, the good, productive Aryan people, against each other. Whereas if we all want to do better, what we have to do is to turn against the Jew and drive him out of our country. And of course, in the 1920s, Henry Ford was not the only one who was saying these things. His good friend, whom he admired as a politician and as an intellectual, Adolf Hitler, was saying the same things as Mr. Ford. And you might know that Ford's factories that he built in Germany eagerly produced war materials for the Nazi regime. At the same time as in the United States, Ford had to be forced to produce tanks for the United States Army. So this sets the stage when we get eventually to the collapse of the world market in 1929. These are the ideas that are out there about inequality and about what property in factories and the means of production has to do with it. Whether poverty and inequality is essentially a problem of either the moral failings of the poor and of the working class, or of a big conspiracy by an alien hostile power, the Jews, or whether this is in fact more about bread and butter things, such as how much people get paid in wages and what they have to pay for with those wages, including bringing up children, educating them, and so forth. So this is not a question that is over, because if you look at the distribution of wealth in the United States today, it is a known fact that it is an extremely uneven distribution, that the United States has not been as unequal now as it has been since the 1890s, since the Gilded Age, when we start this class. And still the question is this a good thing or not? And the debate that you can trace back to Andrew Carnegie, who says, yes, inequality is a virtue. It reflects a deeper truth about the world and civilization, is of course still around. And the question of whether to approach inequality by raising up the bottom, bringing the working class within reach of the trappings of modern civilization, making sure they can lead dignified lives and live in economic security, those are still the main alternatives to how we respond to this inequality. And for that reason, this block of 4 modules in this class, where we discuss these 4 individuals and their contribution, is timely, is highly up to date. So with that introduction, I hope that the groups that will be presenting in these first 4 modules will try to point out the connections between these 4. Talk about how, in fact, what we're looking at is a conversation about the same subject among these 4 people. They may not be talking at the same time. They may not be talking to the same audience, but certainly they are making a contribution to one and the same debate that is ongoing from 1880 to 1929. And that is all I have to say for today.